My plan, it's a big room I have to scan to keep an eye on all of you, so make sure nobody gets in any trouble. I'm not good at pushing buttons, but I'm a professor. We have trouble with basic things like pushing buttons. That's much better. All right, so thanks for having me here. I'm going to go through the main ideas of this book fairly quickly because I want to leave a lot of time not only for questions, but for challenges, your own reflections, your own comments on this. Before I get into the topic tonight, I want to say a bit about how this all came about, why a guy is standing up in front of you talking about patriarchy and feminism. This all started for me in 1988 when I wandered back to graduate school because I wanted to train to become a university professor. And when I got to graduate school, I started doing reading in radical feminism. Now, at that point in my life, I was 30 years old, and I already knew a lot about feminism. I knew that feminists were ugly women who couldn't get dates. Yeah, that was a joke. It's okay. So, in other words, I didn't know anything. I knew what the popular culture had taught me to think about feminism. As a man socialized in the contemporary United States, I was trained to think about feminism as a threat. Whatever feminists were, whatever they believed, I was trained to believe it wasn't going to be good for me. Right? Whatever feminists thought, I was going to suffer because of that. Right? So the first thing I had to do is realize that everything I'd been trained to think about feminism was in fact wrong. And this book is in some sense just an account of how I came to understand that. Now, it is a little strange for a man to be standing up and talking about feminism, especially because I think this is a disproportionately female audience. There's a lot of women in the room. And so I want to make one thing clear. I'm not telling women how to think about their own experience. What I'm trying to do is talk about what I learned from feminism. And the one thing I learned is that threat that I perceived from feminism was exactly wrong. That in fact, feminism was not a threat to me and other men. Feminism was a gift to us. It was not only a way to understand the experience of women in the world, but a way to understand my own experience as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that near the end. All right. So the way I'm going to proceed is simply by taking the title, because a lot of these terms are either unfamiliar to many people or defined in various ways, and so we need to be clear. The End of Patriarchy, Radical Feminism for Men. So the first thing we'll talk about is patriarchy. This is not a term that you hear used in political dialogue very much. A lot of people would say it's an old-fashioned term, but I think it's still a very important term to understand. I'm going to argue first, or define patriarchy. Then I'm going to explain why I think it needs to end. I'm going to talk about why feminism is the vehicle for ending patriarchy and why I think a very radical feminism is appropriate. And then I'll conclude by talking about what I think this has to offer to men. So let's start with this term patriarchy. Right? Its root it literally means rule of the father. Right? Its origins are to describe a family in some sense, but what we mean by patriarchy these days is any system of institutionalized male dominance, any system in which men have power over women. All right. Now, that needs some explanation because different societies are organized in different ways. Two societies can both be patriarchal but yet look very different. So let's talk about what we mean by that. To do that, I'm just going to use some definitions from important feminist scholars. A woman named Gerda Lerner, who wrote a very important book called The Creation of Patriarchy, defined patriarchy as the manifestation and institutionalization of male dominance over women and children in the family, and the extension of male dominance over women in society in general. So we're talking about a system, institutionalized male dominance. What does that immediately tell us? That it doesn't mean that every man has complete authority over every woman at every moment. It's a much more sophisticated and complex system in that. Right? She goes on, patriarchy implies that men hold power in all the important institutions of society and that women are routinely deprived of access to that power, but it does not imply that women are either totally powerless or totally deprived of rights, influence, and resources. That's important. We just had a presidential election in which one of the contenders was a woman. We can't pretend that women are completely pushed out of all positions of power. Here's a definition from another scholar, a sociologist named Alan Johnson. He said, a society is patriarchal to the degree that it promotes male privilege by being male-dominated, male-identified, and male-centered. Male-dominated, male-identified, and male-centered. If you have trouble remembering that, I'm getting older, I like to have memory devices. Let me see, male-dominated, D, male-identified, I, male-centered. Just wanted to see who was awake, okay. One last definition really quickly from another historian, Judith Bennett. She said, almost every girl born today will face more constraints and restrictions than will be encountered by a boy who is born today into the same social circumstances as that girl. Let me do that one again, that's important. Almost every girl born today will face more constraints and restrictions than will be encountered by a boy who is born today into the same social circumstances. So once again, we're not saying that all men are always dominant over all women. Right? Gender is not the only thing that affects our life outcomes, that affects our situations. There are racial disparities, class disparities, disparities based on national origin, all sorts of things. What Judith Bennett is saying is that if you take a boy and a girl who are born into the same social circumstances, the girl will routinely face more constraints and restrictions than the boy in that circumstance. Now, there's a lot of people in the room, a lot of women especially, who may have had male siblings. You can do a quick check on this. Did your experience mirror that of your male sibling or vice versa? Right? And I think very quickly we can talk clearly about how the world is complicated, but there are patterns to that world. And one of these patterns is about women and men. Right? Patriarchy is a term that we want to use to describe a society in which men have a form of dominance over women, and that will change from period to period in history, and it will change from society to society. So I'm going to argue that the United States is a patriarchal society. I would also argue that, take another country, Saudi Arabia is a patriarchal society. Right? Do they look the same? Do they have the same social practices? No. Right? But both are based on institutionalized male dominance. In fact, all the world today, for the most part, is based on that. Patriarchy goes back to a period in human history, maybe 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, when men started to claim ownership of women, specifically of women's reproductive power and sexual power. There's a history to patriarchy. That history changes over time, but it is still, I think, an important term to describe the world we live in today. Even a world in which we came close to having a female president. But this shouldn't be a hard thing to understand. We also recently had, for 2 terms, an African-American president, yes? Did that mean white supremacy had disappeared in America because we had elected a black president? No. Right? So systems of power can morph, they can change, they can adapt to challenges, but it doesn't mean that that power disappears. So I think it's still appropriate to talk about the United States as a patriarchal society. I'll give you a few examples at the end of why I think that. All right. The end of patriarchy. I'm arguing patriarchy should end. I'm not predicting when it's going to happen. Don't read the book thinking, when's it coming? When's the end of patriarchy coming? I've been waiting for that. No, not going to predict it, but I think that if there is to be an end of patriarchy, it will come through feminism, the term traditionally used for a political movement that challenges institutionalized male dominance. Now, feminism is a term that means lots of different things to lots of people. Some people run away from it, some people embrace it. The people who embrace it might have different definitions of it, so we need to talk a bit about feminism as well. Right? Feminism at its core would understand the oppression of women, the systematic disadvantaging of women as a product of patriarchy, as a product of that system of institutionalized male dominance. And therefore, it's a vehicle for challenging that and trying to address the routine injuries to girls and women in a patriarchal society. But it's also more than that, at least for me. I think at the core of feminism is not only a critique of the hierarchy of men over women, but a critique of hierarchy more generally, because as we've already pointed out and everyone in the room knows, the domination, subordination of male over female is not the only system of power in the world today. The ones we commonly talk about are race, class, and national origin. Your chances in the world depend very much on those kinds of identities. And in each one, the problem is a problem of hierarchy. I use the term white supremacy. The problem of white supremacy is that people like me have routinely asserted hierarchical power over people who look like a lot of you in the room. Right? We recognize that to be illegitimate, that assertion of hierarchy is unjustified. And feminism is one way I came to understand that problem of hierarchy. So for me, feminism is not only about challenging men's domination of women, but also opening up this question of hierarchy more generally, which you can open up through other political and intellectual movements as well, such as the challenge to white supremacy, the challenge to the wealth inequality and capitalism, the challenge to the way the first world dominates much of the rest of the world. All of those are places where you can start to look at the question of hierarchy. Why is there a group of people with more power and a disproportionate share of the world's wealth over others? It's a fundamental question that we perhaps don't ask enough. All right. So feminism is both a critique of men's oppression of women, but a critique of hierarchy more generally. It's also both an intellectual enterprise and a political movement. Feminism is a way of thinking about the world. That's what I mean by intellectual. I don't mean that in some, elitist way. We're all engaged in intellectual activity every day, trying to understand how the world works. Feminism is a way to think about the world. It's also a way to take action in the world, a way to both analyze and to act. And to me, that was always an important part of feminism as well. All right. I mentioned this term radical feminism. That's a phrase that may not be familiar to people because the radical feminist movement that I identify as my political home, the movement that I have my roots in, is, as feminism goes today, fairly marginal. You don't hear a lot about it. Right? I mentioned Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton would typically, to the degree she would identify as a feminist, and she did to some degree, would identify as a liberal feminist. Right? Radical feminism is a different project. Right? To explain what I mean by this, I want to quote a radical feminist writer who had a big impact on my thinking. Her name was Andrea Dworkin. She died about 10 years ago. And she described feminism, the radical feminism that she considered herself a part of. She said, this is a movement against suffering. It was an honest account of the suffering of women and girls in the world, and a movement that was foursquare designed to challenge that suffering. Now, that's important because Andrea pointed out that we live in a society that doesn't like to talk about suffering. We like to talk about happiness. It's a very happy society, right? And if you're not happy, there's a one-step cure for that. Go shopping, yes? If you're not happy, just go to the mall, for God's sake. Just buy something. You'll feel better. Andrea was pointing out that this is a society that does not like to look at the dark side. Right? It's the most affluent society in the history of the world, and a society that tells you in some sense that you can buy your way to happiness, and that you do not have to feel the pain that comes from living in societies defined by all these hierarchies. And Andrea said, quote, one of the things the women's movement does is make you feel the pain. So you're going to understand now why I'm a teacher and not in sales, because I want to invite you into a movement that promises that you will feel the pain. Not a good sales pitch, right? Except in some ways I think it is, because I think all of us live in this world aware of not just the pain that comes from being human. You know, human beings, we get sick, we die, people disappoint us. There's a lot of routine pain that comes from just being human. But she's talking about the pain that comes from living in these hierarchical systems, especially the pain that comes from living in patriarchy. And for women especially, that pain is unavoidable. You can try to mask it, but you can't buy your way out of it. And I think what Andrea meant was that if that pain is an inevitable part of life, better to face it. Better to embrace a way past it rather than trying to hide from it. And so in a sense, I think that is a strong sales pitch, to invite you to consider a political and intellectual movement that will guarantee that you feel the pain. Because in some ways, to not feel it is even worse. Right? Now, another thing that radical feminism did was stay focused on this question of the body. And going back to the problem of patriarchy, the two primary ways that men historically have tried to control women by controlling women's bodies, especially their reproductive power and their sexual power. Now, I'm not going to, in the book I don't write about, and I'm not going to take up tonight, the question of reproductive rights for women. That's a controversial subject. It's been controversial my entire adult life, especially when you touch on the question of abortion rights. And I realize that opinions will differ in the room. But it's important to recognize that that has been a feature of the feminist movement pretty much across the board, but certainly also of the radical feminist movement, to argue for women's reproductive rights. Okay. The other question is about women's sexuality and men's attempts to control women's sexuality, literally at some periods of history of men literally claiming ownership over women's bodies. And that is another place where radical feminism has trained its attention. In the book, I take up three specific issues that have to do with the body. One is the question of sexual assault, of rape. I take up the question of the contemporary transgender movement and offer a radical feminist critique of the underlying ideology behind the transgender movement, very controversial. And I also talk about what I call the sexual exploitation industries of pornography and prostitution, and that's the issue I want to talk about briefly before we open it up. What does the radical feminist critique tell us about the contemporary practices in pornography and prostitution, the sexual exploitation industries? Well, the way I've framed that already starts to give you a hint by identifying them as industries of sexual exploitation. In other words, from a radical feminist critique, pornography and prostitution are ways that men, primarily men, routinely buy and sell women's bodies for sexual pleasure. And a radical feminist critique of patriarchy, of men's attempt to control women's bodies, is going to be critical of the way that men routinely buy and sell women's bodies for sexual pleasure. Now, I know this one is also controversial because I'm going to take a wild guess that some of the men in the audience tonight have seen pornography. Okay, that was a joke. My jokes are not doing well tonight, okay? There's a lot of young men in the room. There's a lot of men in the room. All right? This is a porn-saturated society, yes? If I gave you an assignment to find graphic, sexually explicit material on your phones, how long would it take you? You're laughing way too much. You might, no, I'm just kidding. Obviously, it would take 5 seconds, okay? We live in a porn-saturated society in which there's every kind of graphic, sexually explicit material imaginable, but the vast majority of pornography in the world is produced by and for men, especially a primarily heterosexual male audience. So we aren't talking about some abstract philosophical question in some other place. We're talking about the world we live in and our lives. And so I want to acknowledge that up front. Okay? I also want to point out that I'm not going to, I don't have any images. I'm not going to show you any pornography. That's not my goal tonight, that I want to talk a bit about how to understand it. Right? All right. What does a radical feminist critique tell us about pornography and prostitution, these sexual exploitation industries? Well, if we look at the industry, both how it's produced and the kinds of images that pornographers produce, we realize that they are in fact based on presenting women as objectified female bodies for male sexual pleasure. Not only buying and selling women for sexual pleasure, but reducing women to objectified bodies. Not fully human, but simply body parts in some sense to provide that sexual pleasure. Right? Now, I said that radical feminism often goes from a different direction than liberal feminism and other types of feminism. And some of you in the room may be saying, well, wait, I consider myself a feminist and I use porn. Or I consider myself a feminist and I've read lots of feminist work that celebrates pornography. So I'm recognizing there are differences not only in the culture at large, but differences within feminism on this particular question. Right? But I still think that the radical feminist perspective offers us the best way to understand these sexual exploitation industries. Right? So I'm going to offer two ways to demonstrate that. One is, I'm going to assume that all of us in this room today would like to see a more just society, a society in which there's less violence, less discrimination, less oppression, and that one of the criteria for evaluating a just society is how women and girls are treated. In other words, I'm going to assume that people in this room would like to see a society with more gender justice. Just looking around. People are nodding, yeah? Okay. So the first point that I think radical feminists would confront us with is, can you imagine a society achieving any meaningful level of gender justice if one group of people, that is females, can be routinely bought and sold for the sexual pleasure of another group, males? As long as that exists, as long as it is routine for men to buy and sell women's bodies, in other words, as long as there is a difference in those two classes in which one group is given the power to routinely buy and sell another group for sexual pleasure, can you imagine a society ever achieving a meaningful level of gender justice with that condition in place? I can't. And to date, no one's been able to explain to me how that would produce a society that created anything like gender justice. So I think that the buying and selling of one group of people for the sexual pleasure of another is simply inconsistent with the stated goal of achieving gender justice. That's at the philosophical level in some sense. But then we can look at the pornography industry and look at the images it produces and the way it produces those, and we observe something quite interesting. I've been studying the porn industry for now nearly 3 decades, and there are a couple of things that are uncontroversial about pornography over the last 3 decades. These are things that critics of pornography as well as supporters would all agree on. One is that pornography is more mainstream than ever before. And by mainstream, I don't mean that everybody embraces it, but certainly there's more of it. It's more easily accessible than ever before. That was evidenced by the quip about how long it would take you to find it. So again, we are a society in which pornography, which was once a very marginal kind of media that you had to search out, is now square in the center of pop culture and easily accessible to literally everyone. What's interesting is that in the same time period that pornography has become more mainstream and more, I'm going to use the term normalized, it's been made more a normal part of American society. In that exact same period, the actual images in pornography, that is what we see when we pull graphic, sexually explicit material up on our screen, that material is more cruel and degrading to women than ever and more overtly racist than ever. The pornographic images that are common today are more cruel and degrading to women. They present men's sexual pleasure in the context of the domination of women more intensely than ever before. And it's also more overtly racist. In fact, it's the only mass media genre I know that is explicitly racist. So this is what I call the paradox of pornography. How can a media genre that's more accepted than ever, has moved closer to the mainstream, how can it be more overtly cruel and degrading and more overtly racist? That's an interesting observation. And as I said, that's not controversial. What I just said would be accepted by everybody on all sides of the issue. The real question is why? And the answer is, starts with a P. The answer is patriarchy. Yes, that was you should have been quicker on that one, but it's late. I'll give you a pass on that one. Why would sexually explicit material that eroticizes, that makes erotic men's domination of women in more intense and degrading ways than ever, be accepted, if not but for a system of institutionalized male dominance in which men take it as their right to literally own women's bodies, even if it's only for the short period of time of a pornographic film? These are the difficult questions. Remember when I said, Andrea said, she wants you to feel the pain? This is what she means, right? And that pain, I think, is real for both men and women. It's not the same for men and women. It's not equivalent. But for women, I'm not a woman, but I can only imagine what it feels like to know that you live in a society in which men routinely are aroused to orgasm by images of you being sexually demeaned. Right? I can't imagine that that feels very good, especially when the use of pornography is so widespread. I assume that is painful. Now, as a man socialized to be a guy in this culture, right, there's also a way in which it's, I think, painful for us, which is to recognize that that's how I was raised. I was raised to find that sexually arousing. Right? And if that method of becoming sexually aroused is inconsistent with my own moral principles, my own philosophy, my own claim to be an advocate for gender justice, yet I've been socialized to have that response, I have to confront that, and that's painful too. Again, I'm not saying they're equivalent. Right? I think it's much harder to be a woman in a pornographic society than a man. But if we take radical feminism seriously, I think that's the pain that Andrea was asking us to face. All right. Now, you might be saying, I'm not so sure that I'm interested in this particular political and intellectual movement. So I said I would try and make a case for why this is compelling, why we should all be thinking about this. And here's the blunt way to say it. In contemporary America and in other patriarchal societies, I think we men have a choice. We can be a man, and everything that means in the traditional notion of being a man, right? What does being a man in patriarchy mean? It means being in control, right? It means taking what's yours. There's a sense of conquest. And if you're always in control, always striving to be in control, and taking what is yours, that control and conquest inevitably leads to aggression. Aggression against women, but also aggression against each other. Right? If you want to be a man in this society in the sense that patriarchy defines masculinity, you have a choice. You can be a man or you can be a human being, but you can't be both. You can embrace all of that traditional notion of masculinity and that sense of power and control and dominance, or you can strive to be fully human, but you cannot do both. If you decide to be a man, to embrace that traditional notion of masculinity, you will surrender some of your own humanity. And I do not think that is a good trade-off. Right? And so for men, I think the argument for why we might want to embrace a radical feminist that challenges so much of the way we are socialized is because it's not only the right thing to do if we really take our own moral and political principles seriously. It's the right thing to do if you believe in justice like you say you do. But there's also an argument from self-interest, that it is in fact in our own self-interest to reject that definition of masculinity and patriarchy and strive for something more fully human. That there is, for all the pain that is involved in that, there is something on the other side that is a richer, deeper, more meaningful way to live. And I think, to go back to my observation, and this will be my last point, that feminism was for me not only a critique of men's oppression of women, but opened up for me a larger critique of hierarchy in general. I think that formula I just offered, that you can be a man or you can be a human being, challenges us on all of these other aspects of our existence as well. So I'm white. You probably figured that out too. And I would say, just as I said I have the choice of being a man or being a human being, I would say I have a choice of being white or being a human being, but I can't be both. Now, obviously, I'm not going to, the way I look won't change. When I say being white, I mean embracing all that white supremacy tells us about being white, about our natural superiority. I can either embrace that white supremacist conception of being white, or I can be a human being. But if I do want to pretend to be white, in the way the culture socialized me to think about that, I will surrender some of my own humanity. If I happen to be affluent, I can believe in what the culture tells me about how wealth is accumulated. I can be rich, or I can be a human being, but I can't be both. I can't embrace the hierarchy that comes in the modern economic system, contemporary capitalism, and be human. I've got to reject that system if I want to claim my full humanity. And in some ways, I would say the same thing about being an American. I was born in the US, I hold a US passport, I'm an American citizen. Right? And I can be an American and all that means with, America on top. America rightfully on top of the world. Or I can be a human being. But if I decide to embrace that story we tell ourselves about being American, in a sense, being the rightful rulers of the world, I will surrender some of my own humanity. Now, a lot of you are younger than I am, and so take it on faith. I've been on this planet 50 years, and I've tried a lot of ways to avoid the pain, and a lot of ways to avoid these very stark choices. And I've never found one that works, except to look honestly at these systems that distribute wealth and power, to tell the truth about where they come from and how they structure our lives, and to try to move past them. And I think when we do that, we don't eliminate the pain in our lives, because I don't think that's a reasonable expectation. But we do, through the connections we make with other people who are struggling as well, we find a way through that pain. It never ends, it's part of life. But I can tell you from experience that moving through it with other people willing to look honestly at it produces, at least has produced for me, that richer and more meaningful experience in the world. And that is what I would wish for all of you in the room, that you find that way through it with other people, because there is no way through it alone. My last point is my upbeat ending. I don't got one. Anybody out there got an upbeat ending? Okay, I'm not going to, this is the point at where speakers are supposed to then bring it full circle and give you an inspirational moment. And I just want to let you know, I'm not going to do that. Because in some ways I think it would be dishonest. So what I'd rather do is Open it up to questions, as I said, not only questions, I'm happy to answer any questions you have, but also challenges. If there's something I said that you think is just simply wrong, I hope you will let me know. But also your own reflections about your own lives, because as I said, this is not an abstract question about some world out there. This is very much about our own lives and our own bodies, and if you have simply a comment, a reflection on that, I would be happy to hear it as well. So the floor is open.
And while we're waiting on that, Bob's books, or the book, is on sale over there afterwards, and he'll be happy to spend time with anybody afterwards too. Don't be shy about asking a question.
Yeah.
He's got microphone.
There's a hand over there too. Yeah, go ahead.
How do you differentiate radical feminism and egalitarianism when it comes to ending the patriarchy?
Let me just restate. So there are, as I said, lots of different kinds of feminism. I was arguing for a particular type that tends to be called radical feminism. The other primary version of feminism, I said, is kind of liberal feminism, although you'll hear other terms. So sometimes you'll hear the term third wave feminism. Yeah. You'll hear the term intersectional feminism, and people will define these in different ways. Right? But here's the way I would distinguish between radical feminism and these other often more popular versions. Right? Liberal feminism, for instance, tends to ask one question, which is how do you maximize the opportunities for women in the systems that exist today? Right? Radical feminism, I think, asks a different question, which is, are these systems themselves legitimate? So one place where this is most evident is in economics. So there was a famous book written 2 or 3 years ago by the CEO of Facebook named Sheryl Sandberg called Lean In. You know this? You young people probably wouldn't have read it. So Sheryl Sandberg is the CEO of Facebook. What does that tell you? She's really, really rich, right? Okay. And her book was all designed to explain to women how to succeed in the business world, because she makes the observation that women often are not aggressive enough in the business world. For instance, they don't know how to ask for raises. Right? And so she said what you have to do is lean in to the system. Right? Now, that's a conception of feminism that says women and men are treated unequally, and what women have to do is assert themselves within that system. Radical feminism was more likely to ask, is contemporary capitalism consistent with a just society? Right? Now, there are other forms of feminism that ask those questions again, but when it comes down to it, the thing that often separates radical and more liberal versions of feminism are things around the body, especially these questions about sexual exploitation. In some sense, anyone who identifies as feminism is seeking a more egalitarian world, a world in which power is distributed more equally as opposed to hierarchically. Right? The question is, how do we get there? And which systems are simply incompatible with that? So there have been, feminists arguing for 50 years about this, and it's hard to summarize it all in one. But I think the question of are any systems of hierarchy legitimate at all is an important one. Yeah?
In your opinion, is Darwinism important to feminism?
Is Darwinism important to feminism? Evolution by natural selection is the only credible approach to modern biology. Therefore, it's important to everything. There is no single question in human experience for which our evolutionary history is not important. So yes, I think it is. The question is, though, what lessons do we learn from evolution by natural selection in the realm of gender? Right? Well, here's what I would say to that real quickly. For one thing, we have to realize that patriarchy is not an enduring permanent feature of human history. If you'll grant me a little digression, human beings, Homo sapiens, our species, animals that are no different than us essentially, have been on the planet about 200,000 years. Our evolutionary history encompasses about 200,000 years from the first humans in Africa. Through about 95% of that evolutionary history, up until about 10,000 years ago, every human who lived on the face of the earth lived in a relatively small band-level hunting and gathering society in which there was no discernible hierarchy as we know it today, and nothing like patriarchy as we understand it today. So the first thing is to realize that when people say, well, men dominate humans, there's nothing can be done about it, it's just the way people are. It goes back to the caveman. You know the caveman, yeah? And if it goes back to the caveman, what can you do about it? And the only problem is that's not true. Institutionalized male dominance is a product of the last 10,000 years of human history, which means there was a period of human history that was pre-patriarchal. It doesn't mean that in that period people were all nice and lovey-dovey to everybody. I mean, human beings are pretty nasty creatures, in case you haven't noticed. We are capable of doing really nasty things to each other. Right? But this idea that patriarchy is always been the organizing principle for human societies is simply not true. It's a product of history. And that's the first lesson to take away from our evolutionary history. The next question, and this is the tough one, is male and female are different in reproductive terms. We're a sexually dimorphic species. This body that I have will never bear a child. I will never lactate, gestate, or menstruate, as they say. Okay? That's a pretty important difference. Reproduction is important in organic beings. Right? The real question is, do those reproductive differences between male and female inevitably dictate big differences in our psychological, intellectual, or moral development? That is, do men and women feel differently, think differently, and reason morally differently as a result of these very material and real differences in reproduction? Here's the answer to that question. We don't know. We don't have the intellectual tools to know that. In patriarchy, the story is that men and women are so vastly different that, as one writer put it, we should just think of ourselves as different species. Or in the title of a famous book from about 20 years ago, women are from Venus and men are from Mars. Right? That we're so different, we're from two different planets. There's no evidence to suggest that's a meaningful way to look at it. In fact, when you look at the research, especially in psychology, that's been done about differences between men and women outside of reproduction, most of those differences disappear pretty quickly. Right? That we are if you think about it, we are fundamentally much more similar than we are different. And that's what I take away from thinking about this in sort of biological and evolutionary terms.
Okay, so what's the point I'm trying to make here? So you're a man,
Mm-hmm.
and you're here talking to us about feminism. Some people in society would say that's odd. Some would be totally with you, agree with you. You seem very passionate about it. So what keeps you going? What keeps you passionate about this? What keeps you coming to seminars and talking about this passion?
What keeps me going is cheap beer and Netflix, same as everybody else. And how would any of us... Oh, wait, that was a joke. I'm just kidding. Okay, so I'm going to answer that in kind of a roundabout way. The reason I think I was drawn to a feminist critique is because that it answered a lot of my own struggles. So I'm an adult of average size today, but when I grew up, I was very late coming into puberty. I was very short, very skinny, and very effeminate in traditional terms. I was the kid who walked around with a sign on his back saying, "It's okay to beat me up," right? And so I knew growing up intuitively that this idea of a real man was not me. But in that period of my life, literally you spend most of your time trying to avoid being beaten up, right? So I survived that. Eventually I, grew, and in my 20s started to try to learn to be a man in the way the society told me. Right? The problem is I wasn't very good at it. Right? I never was really very good at being a real guy. Right? I wasn't I wasn't good at starting fight in bars or any of this stuff that guys are supposed to do. I still can barely throw a football. I mean, so at every stage in my life, it was clear to me that I couldn't really fulfill this cultural category of a real man. And so when I stumbled into feminism, I grabbed onto it. It was like, okay, this answers not only the question of why do men routinely sexually assault women, or why is the pornography industry booming, or all these other questions that are really about the injuries that men visit upon women and girls. It also answered my own question of why am I so miserable all the time? Okay. Now, if you're sitting in the audience and you're saying, well, I am a real man, okay, which some people fit that category much better than I ever did. Here's what I learned in talking about feminism with men, which is that even the guys who looked like the epitome of masculinity, I had a friend in high school who was literally the high school quarterback and the prom king. And I always assumed he had it made, right? His life was a bed of roses. What I learned from talking to men is that even the men who almost exactly fit the stereotype of a real man are constantly bedeviled by a sense of insecurity, that none of us ever really can live up to it. And therefore, in addition to the ways feminism explain and help us understand the damage men do in the world, it also is a way to understand our own insecurities. And that's why it was attractive to me, and that's why 30 years later it still is compelling to me. The society, in some ways, we've lost ground, especially on the subject I've studied a lot, which is pornography. There's more pornography, it's more extreme, more cruel than ever before. But, there's no guarantee that the world's going to get better just because you have an idea of why it should and how it should. And, everybody in the room probably has had some experience of struggling against impediments, problems that don't get solved overnight. I mean, the story of all resistance movements is the story of digging in for the long haul. And there's true of this as much as anything else. Yeah. Oh.
When we look at the events of male dominance, is there a particular way we can raise our children, or is it just like, for example, like I was told like never to walk the street alone, or be careful like what you wear? So is there a way that we can raise children or the new generation to not have like this critical meaning along the male dominance?
So it's a reasonable question, because the place where we feel like we can have the most influence is on the people in our immediate circle, and especially for those of us who have been parents, it means a lot about thinking about child rearing. And of course, people do often raise their children to resist patriarchal norms. They raise girls not to accept the idea that their primary value in the world is to be objectified female bodies for male pleasure. And no doubt lots of people were raised to resist that or are raising children to resist that. When we have boy children, we can raise them to challenge the notion of what it means to be a real man. We can not immediately push them to play football, all those sort of very basic things. But it's also true that you cannot change the world through parenting, right? And that it's attractive to want to do that when political movements seem to be so slow and to often lose ground. You want to find a way to make a difference other than politics. And by politics in this context, I don't just mean voting in elections, I mean politics in the bigger sense. But I think the best way to try and help our children is to actively participate in political movements that challenge those hierarchies. I don't know, I have a son who's now 25 years old, and to the degree I had any positive influence on him, it might be that I simply took him to a lot of political meetings. Right? You drag your kid to things because you can't afford a babysitter or whatever it is. But I also did it quite consciously because I wanted him to see what it looked like for adults to get together to talk about the problems of the world and to make a commitment to engaging in some kind of activity to try and change them. Yeah. So in some sense, I think the most important thing any of us can do, including those of us who are parents, is to get politically active. For me, a lot of that has been in a variety of movements. In this arena, it's been mostly the feminist critique of pornography. But I've also worked in other kinds of political movements, anti-war movements, and I've written about a lot of these subjects. And I think that's the answer. Right? Not with any guarantee of success, short-term or long-term, but to know that that's where the action is in some sense. Yeah. Whoever, yeah.
Do you, in the world today, do you not see the roles somewhat reversed, as in how women have become maybe males? How we make them look stupid, like in sitcoms and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned the pornography losing ground. What about the amount of women and young women adults that are now involved in it actively and willingly, and now they're the ones viewing it versus more the males?
Yeah. So there is a phenomenon of sort of men as the butt of jokes in sitcoms. I don't watch enough of them to know, but I hear that this is in fact a pattern. And I'm not so sure I would enjoy those kinds of shows. I probably wouldn't find the jokes funny, but I don't find the jokes in most American sitcoms funny at all anyway. But I think it's important to recognize that when you're in a position of institutionalized dominance, jokes about you don't have the same effect as jokes about people on the bottom of that hierarchy. Right? That when you're in a position of power, it's actually easier to poke fun at you in a certain sense. And that the jokes don't have the same effect. In other words, if you have a consistent portrayal of women in television shows as nothing more than objectified bodies for male pleasure, that has a real impact on the way people see women in the world. If you have an occasional joke about a dad who can't, turn on the stove without help or something, these jokes about male incompetence, what effect does that really have on the world, on men's place in the world? It probably doesn't have much. So that's one point. The other question you asked is really crucial. As the pornography industry has expanded, it's included a lot more women, not only female performers, but women directors and all that kind of thing. Right? And how can a feminist movement critique a media form that women are participating in? Well, there's a couple of things. One is any system of power can find people in the subordinated group who will do work for them. Right? In another context, they're sometimes called Uncle Toms. Ooh, excuse me. It's a highly charged question, right? To ask, how do you understand people who gain some sort of wealth or power from a system that systematically puts people like them in a subordinated position? Right? But here's another way I would suggest we think about it, and this is more about the women who perform in pornography than the women who are making money as producers. It's often pointed out that these women choose to be there, yes? Who are we, a radical feminist movement, to critique the choices of women to perform in pornography, or for that matter, to work in prostitution? Right? Well, I take that seriously because I tried to avoid imposing my own judgments on other people. I don't think it's appropriate in general. But if we're going to talk about choices, we have to talk about the conditions under which people choose. Right? So I was talking about this earlier with some faculty. Do students ever take tests when they think the test is stupid? Has anyone in the room ever taken a test where you thought it was a really stupid test? You were raising your hand right away. You know, probably took one at what? 2 o'clock this afternoon, a stupid test. Okay. Right. You are in a class. You have evidence that the exams the professor gives you are stupid. I'm just using that. They're a bad way to gauge your learning. Has that ever happened? Do you take the test anyway? So you choose to. You choose to take that exam under conditions that are not of your own making. Right? There's a constraint on you. If you don't take the exam, you won't pass the course. If you don't pass the course, you're going to have to retake the course. You're going to have to pay for it again. It might delay your graduation. There's all sorts of reasons students do things they believe make no sense because of the system in which they're operating. But it is a choice, yes? Because you could choose otherwise. You could choose to walk out of the class. You could choose to abandon except there are costs to that. Right? So every choice that any human being makes is always under some constraint and some opportunity. Right? And the question is, what are those constraints and what are those opportunities? And so if we're going to talk about choices women make in pornography, or for that matter, they make anywhere in the world, the first question would be, what are the conditions under which people are choosing? And we have a fair amount of data, especially about women in prostitution, to a lesser degree about women in pornography. But there are some patterns in the lives of women in those industries. One is that they rarely come from wealthy families, that virtually all of the women in pornography, prostitution, and stripping as well are coming from positions of some limited economic opportunity, often without much formal education, often with disproportionately high rates of experience of childhood sexual assault, which has an effect on people's psychology and what they believe they're capable of doing. And there are rampant rates of drug and alcohol abuse. That's the real world in which those women choose. Let me give you an example of a friend of mine who's now a practicing therapist. But when she was younger, she worked for a certain amount of time in a strip club. And she said that when she was in that strip club, she would have told you that she was empowered, that she was doing this to make money, she was proud of her work, she was proud of her body, and she felt a sense of power over the men who she was dancing for. She said, the entire time I was stripping, that's the story I would have told you. She said it was only much later that she realized that she had not dealt with a history of sexual assault as a child, which had dramatically affected her psychology, and that almost every time she was up on stage dancing, she was drunk or stoned, because it was the only way she could get through it. Right? So which of those stories is true? The story she told when she was stripping, or the story she would tell today with the capacity to critically self-reflect about that? Well, those are the kinds of real-world questions we have to ask about the sexual exploitation industries, I think. Yeah.
Hi,
Mm-hmm.
I'm here with my European history class, and we've been talking about the women's suffrage movement, and more specifically the kind of militant aspect of that.
Yeah.
And my question is, what is militant feminism? Like, what does it look like in modern American society, and does the type of radical feminism that you identify with kind of advocate for that type of feminism?
So militant in this sense is more of a strategic or tactical question, I think. So let's say you have a radical critique of a system of authority you believe to be illegitimate, like patriarchy. Right? That's an analytic perspective, how to understand the world. The question is, how do you change the world? And those tactics and strategies will differ depending on time, place, and the kind of person you are. Right? I don't lean toward militancy because I'm a nice, quiet boy from the Midwest who's afraid of conflict or something, right? I have friends who are much more militant than me in their orientation toward the world. Today, radical feminism, you will find radical feminists who will argue for more militant action, but there's really not a well worked out strategy for that. But again, I know the anti-pornography movement best, and in the 1970s and 80s, when that movement was much stronger, one of the actions women would do would be to take tours of the pornography district. This was back in a time when if you wanted pornography, you went to a specific part of town. Now those areas are largely gone because of the nature of the business. But they would take groups of women down to, Times Square in New York was the quintessential porn district. And some of those women would also plan actions where they would go into pornography stores and destroy pornographic magazines. Did I mention this was a long time ago when most pornography was distributed through magazines, which is a small part of the business today. So that's a militant action to go down. Now, obviously, destroying porn magazines isn't going to end the porn industry. It's a symbol, but it has a kind of militant cast to it. But that was at a time when the feminist anti-pornography movement was much stronger and much larger. To do that today, you would just kind of look silly. Right? So strategies and tactics all develop in a larger question of what is the movement trying to accomplish and what can it accomplish in the moment. And so there's not a lot of militancy that I see in feminism today, largely I think because it just wouldn't make much sense as a tactic. Oh, whoever has the mic.
Right here.
Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I think you mentioned transgender.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think, if you can just briefly state, how do you think that affects the patriarchy?
Well, this is the most controversial part of the book, and it's, quite frankly, some earlier writing I did on this lost me some friends who disagreed. So ever since the late 1970s, there's been a debate within feminism about the idea of transgenderism. It's hard to summarize quickly, but in the book, I ask a question, pose a challenge, and express a concern. So I'll do it really quickly. Most of feminism, especially liberal feminism today, embraces the idea of transgender. The radical feminist movement is the source of a critique of the concept of transgender. Not a critique of any individual who identifies as transgender or feels that identity, but of the underlying idea behind it. Part of the problem of discussing this is that the term transgender is an umbrella term for a wide variety of different ideas, right? So to try and categorize this, the way I say it in the book is, if the transgender claim is that someone like me who was born unambiguously male, right, is claiming to be truly female, right, that I'm a male human being in this sexually dimorphic species, but I actually want to claim to be female. My question is, what does that mean? Because I don't understand that claim. As a statement about biology, it simply makes no sense to me. Okay. Now, just saying that out loud, right, already risks me being called a bigot. But it's a question that I think is on a lot of people's minds. If someone is biologically male and asserts to be female, for instance, what could that possibly mean? Because this body will never be designed in a way to bear a child. Okay. The challenge is somewhat different. If transgender means that I was born unambiguously male, as I was, but I feel uncomfortable in the traditional norms associated with masculinity. And in fact, I might even feel more comfortable in the traditional norms associated with femininity in patriarchy. That I understand completely. That's easy to understand. Partly because most of us have had some experience of that somewhere. As I said, I grew up in a way that was traditionally not masculine, and I often felt out of sync with the gender norms assigned to me as a boy. The question there, and the challenge that radical feminism poses, is how do we deal with that? And the radical feminist answer is you deal with the problem of these very rigid gender norms by going after their source, which is patriarchy. All right. The concern I talk about in the book is the manipulation of the human body through surgery, hormones, and chemicals when those people who identify as trans engage in surgery and hormone treatment. Those are very dramatic interventions into the body that I think are very disturbing in certain ways, and we don't talk about it very much. So the chapter on transgenderism, which has been the most controversial part of the book, I think is simply raising questions that need to be asked, and in contemporary society, we're not talking about them. So in Texas, the big issue at the moment is the bathroom bill, right? Who gets to use what restroom and changing facilities? But for all that, think of all the newspaper articles you might have read about the bathroom bill. Did any of those stories, or any of the politicians involved in this, ever deal with these fundamental questions? I don't see it being debated very much. And so I think what's happening is we're having a policy debate about transgenderism that's ignoring the questions that are at the heart of what we're claiming. And I don't think that's healthy. I don't think you can have a meaningful debate about public policy, about what laws to pass, without understanding the underlying claims. That's what I do in the book. And like I said, I'm not kidding you. People who I considered friends will not speak to me anymore because of this, because they think the argument I'm making is somehow a bigoted argument, which I obviously don't think it is. I think it's an honest set of questions. Yeah.
Returning to like strategies for societal change, you said
Mhm.
the best way to produce change in like hierarchical and oppressive societies is to use political movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
So can the argument be made that minority political movements are at a disadvantage in the current political hierarchy in the society we live in now? So they're kind of like stifled in their own attempts for change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, almost by definition, if you are pursuing what you were calling a minority position, challenging well-entrenched systems of power, yes, you're at a disadvantage. And that's been the history of challenges to power, right? Challenges to slavery, challenges to feudalism. Every challenge that ever said, listen, the way the society is structured and the way it distributes wealth and power is fundamentally unjust, has always been going against the grain. Right? And how do you win those struggles? Well, as I said, strategy and tactics are not my strong point. Right? But the thing to recognize is that these struggles we're talking about against patriarchy, against white supremacy, against capitalism, against first world domination, these have been going on for hundreds and in some cases thousands of years. Right? There has been resistance to these systems the minute these systems were created. That's the important thing. Right? If you ask the question, when did, for instance, resistance to white supremacy start? The answer is obvious. At the moment white supremacy was imagined, because the people on the bottom pushed against it. Right? Now movements, they morph over time and they have setbacks and they have victories. But it's all a long struggle. Right? A friend of mine used to say, you've got to be in it for the long haul. It doesn't mean there aren't short-term victories that advance society. Would anyone, I was born in 1958. Is there anyone in the room who would like to go back to the America of 1958? An America in this state marked by Jim Crow segregation, by apartheid, right, in which women were routinely barred access to certain kinds of places in education, in business, in politics. Right? Okay, so why do none of us want to go back and live in 1958? Because there have been successful challenges to those systems of power, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, right? Title IX. Right? Why are some of the women in this room, were you able to play sports in high school? Right? Because of the victories of the feminist movement. It's just that those victories are partial and incomplete. And in some ways, the more that you make progress, the more you see the deep nature of these systems, and so you see other places. And the more those systems push back, and then you die. Okay, that's life. You push, you lose, you win a little bit, and then you die. I mean, that's the nature of being human. And the question is, what kind of life did you live along the way, really? Yeah.
Any more questions? I'd like to thank our director of the Men's Center, Al Dorsey, for co-sponsoring this event tonight. So, last question.
Okay, well, thank you for giving this talk. And I mean, the whole time I was thinking of, my daughter. I have an 8-year-old daughter, of course, and of course I have one. And the world that she's living in, and especially now this political matrix that we're in at this time, and I just want to comment that your talk is very timely, because as we see, the patriarchy has existed for a long time, and it is, and recently, I think it has reasserted itself in a way. It's not only here in the U.S., but what we're seeing seems to be a worldwide resurgence of male misogyny. Yeah. And it's the only thing I want to say is we need to hear more from talks like the one you just gave, and have different conversations about how to engage this, how to how to prepare young children, how to learn new strategies to implement in the classroom. For example, if we teach And, well, I guess that's all I want to say.
That's actually a great way to end. And you'll notice during this entire talk, I never mentioned the name that shall not be mentioned in the discussion of patriarchy. Right? But you remind me to comment on the contemporary electoral system. So obviously I wrote this book came out in mid-January. It actually was available in the US almost exactly on inaugural day. But I didn't predict that. I was writing, and quite frankly, when I was writing the book, I assumed that it would come out on or near the inauguration of the first female president in the United States. That was what all the polls said. That was what I assumed as well. But in a way, the presidential election reminds us of the persistence of patriarchy. So on the one hand, we had a candidate who openly bragged about being a sexual predator. And I don't know who you voted for in the room, in some ways it doesn't matter. I'm just stating what I think are reasonably uncontroversial facts. The Republican candidate for president openly bragged about being a sexual predator, right? About forcing himself on women. The other candidate identified as a feminist in some ways and asserted a sort of feminist account of her candidacy. But think about her policies. Right? Think about military policy. If a radical feminist critique, as I'm trying to articulate it, challenges all the hierarchies that currently structure our world, did the female candidate for president assertively argue for challenging those hierarchies? Not that I could see. Right? So it seems to me the presidential election kind of summarizes this quite well. There's an open and very aggressive misogyny, as you said, right? Up to and including a certain braggadocio about being a sexual predator, which is not an impediment to winning the highest office in America. On the other hand, for a woman to seriously contend for that same office, there must be, call it what it is, a capitulation to certain systems of power that simply can't be challenged. Right? Both of those are flip sides of the patriarchal coin. Right? One open and crude, one more subtle, but still, in a sense, an embrace of hierarchy. And okay, that upbeat ending. Where the hell did that upbeat ending? I knew it was out there for a minute. I had it, and then it slipped out of my grasp. But again, I just think it's important to recognize that if that election had turned out differently in the Electoral College, I wouldn't change a word of what I said tonight. I don't think there's anything that I said tonight that would be disproved by the election of a female president, just as the critiques that I and many other people have been making of white supremacy for many, many years, including a book I wrote about that, were not disproved by the election of Barack Obama. This isn't about whether or not certain people are allowed into positions of power. It's about the way the system works. And as I said, in the end, it's in patriarchy very much about women's bodies and the degree to which women are able to control their own bodies in the world and feel safe in that world. And unfortunately, the answer to that is that there is still much work to do. And so my last point is to, before I start thanking everybody, is to also tell you I have a sign-up sheet. I have an email list where I send out new articles I write. It's one every couple of weeks at the most. And if anybody wants to be on that list, you can come up and put your email address down. There are books, this book, The End of Patriarchy, over on the table, and I have copies of other books if people want to look at them. And the only other thing I have to do is, this is at least my third trip to Lone Star College-Kingwood, and I would like to say thank you because I get invited to speak often and speak all over the country. I rarely get invited back for reasons that you might be able to understand. So it's especially nice to be back. I always get a smile on my face when I get on 290 and leave Austin on my way to Kingwood. So John and everybody else who's made this possible, thank you very much. It's been great. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.